This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Magnus Carlsen taking on Sergey Karjakin at the 2012 World Blitz Championship. And Sergey with the white pieces as he essays a Rui Lopez and a Berlin by Carlsen. Let's hope this doesn't end in a Berlin draw. But back in 2012, the Berlin draw with d takes e5 was not quite as popular as it is now. And indeed, Sergey Karjakin heads straight for the Berlin endgame as the trade of queens happens on d8. Knight from b1 is developed to c3. Carlsen responds automatically with a move h6 to defend the g5 square. This is one of the most well-studied endgames, one of the most well-studied theoretical positions of all time. Both Carlsen and Karjakin are specialists on both sides of the Berlin. This is going to be an interesting one. This is going to be a doozy. And Caruana responds with h3. Magnus pushing his queenside pawn up to a6. And this is a slow maneuvering stage of the game when both sides are trying to control key squares with their pawns and pieces. As Sergey Karjakin develops his bishop to f4, and one of the ideas of the move a6 by Carlsen is that later on in the game, when he pushes his c-pawn up to c5, and he could do that to create a c6 square for his light-squared bishop, the b5 square is not going to be quite as weak. And Karjakin, he takes the first significant think of the game. All of White's minor pieces are developed. Karjakin has to figure out how he's going to position his rooks. His rooks are clearly not optimized. One path he could take is doubling rooks on the d file. He could also arrange his rooks on e1 and d1, or he could continue moving his pawns up with a move a3 if he wants to prevent Carlsen's bishop, his dark squared bishop, from developing to b4. And the choice he makes is rook d1 to d3. He thinks that that is the best square for the rook. He clearly is preparing either a doubling of the rooks, or maybe he wants the a1 rook to move into e1 in order to support his strongest pawn, that e5 pawn, which in certain cases can actually move up to e6 and sacrifice itself for the greater good of piece activity. Knight f5 to e7, a very typical Berlin move. It looks very strange to block the dark squared bishop, but that is completely temporary. That knight from e7 is going to swing to g6 in order to harass the bishop on f4 and put pressure on the pawn on e5. And eventually Carlsen is going to develop that dark squared bishop. It might take him some time though, as Karjakin indeed doubles his rooks on the d file, and the bishop from d7 parks itself on a very well protected square. It moves to e6, but now it moves into c4. So Karjakin wasn't threatening to win the bishop on e6, but that trade is often undesirable for black in the Berlin. And there's that c5 move. And Carlsen is looking very prescient for playing a6 all the way back 10, 15 moves ago, because Karjakin could not go to b5 in that position. He has to move back to b3, and that knight is very passive, but there's that e6 move. And Karjakin thinks this is the best time for it. Now, this is not even a sacrifice, because if Carlsen takes that pawn, and he most probably will, then Karjakin is going to respond with bishop f4 takes c7. And with that knight sitting on e7, with the dark squared bishop still blocked, is Carlsen going to have enough equipment to defend all of his queenside pawns? Because after bishop takes e6, bishop takes c7, as we see Carlsen kind of grabbing his head there, he clearly missed or underestimated this move. Now, he obviously knows this idea, but it's so easy to miss this in certain positions. After bishop takes e6, bishop takes c7, Carlsen will not be able to push his b pawn up to b5 because the knight from b3 can take the pawn on c5. And once one of these pawns fall, then the entire queen side is liable to fall. And Carlsen has to be incredibly careful here. Will he find a way out of this? And my guess is maybe he'll take on e6 with a pawn in order to create a hiding square for the king on f7, because to add insult to injury, after bishop takes c6, bishop takes c7, there was a mate threat on d8, and Carlsen indeed sees nothing better than taking on e6 with the pawn, and he moves his knight up to d5, and that was the real point of taking on e6 with the pawn. And he's going to lose a pawn, though, as Karjakin gobbles up the pawn on b6, and the opening has been an abject failure for black. But the game is not over, and that was a really good move by Carlsen. c5, c4, forcing the knight back to c1. And this gives Carlsen a couple of much-needed tempi that he can use to at last complete his development and get that darned dark squared bishop out of the gates. But first, he plays the move c3, and he sacks another pawn, but he does that in order to permanently cripple White's pawn majority on the queen side. I think that was a great move. And Karjakin is currently up 2 pawns. Both of those c-pawns are extra pawns, but they need defense. They are very weak, and they can be easily attacked by the rook from c8 and by the dark squared bishop, which I think is coming either to g5 to harass the rook on d2 and the knight on c1, or to f6 in order to put more pressure on the pawn. And Karjakin gets the knight out of the line of fire of the bishop, but Magnus has done such a nice job of generating serious drawing chances after missing e6. And I think Karjakin may have mishandled the minor piece play in the last couple of moves. Now the c3 pawn is hanging, and it is not easy to defend. The problem is if you play knight b3 to d4, then you lose the pawn on a2. Carlsen has positioned his bishops on absolutely ideal squares as he moves his king up from e8 to f7. He's coordinating the rooks, and Karjakin doing everything he can to defend the pawn on c3, but there go Carlsen's rooks. Rook c8 to c7, another excellent move as he continues to accumulate the queenside pressure, and finally Karjakin moves that knight out of b3 to a5, offering the a2 pawn as a sacrifice, but Carlsen does not take it. He thinks that keeping the bishop on d5 in order to keep Karjakin's rooks at bay is more important. Karjakin forces that bishop out of d5 as he sacrifices one of his c-pawns in order to get his rook to the 7th rank. What an ingenious concept by the Russian grandmaster. Rook d7 check, leading to a trade of rooks. Rook takes d7. Where is Carlsen going to put his king? He moves it back to e8. And the reason he did that, he doesn't want to give away his c4 bishop. Now, if white takes on c4, black is actually not going to take the rook because that leads to a fork. Knight b6 check. But after knight takes c4, rook takes c4, both Karjakin's rook and his bishop and the c2 pawn will be hanging. So that's out of the question. Karjakin has to move his rook, but that means keeping the black bishop alive and giving up the a2 pawn. I think Carlsen has now fully recovered, and it might be time for Karjakin to start thinking about how to bail out here. And he decides to play rook to d6 after quite a bit of hesitation. Carlsen takes on a2. Karjakin is going to take on a6. Then Carlsen is going to take on c2. And what an incredible job by the world number one, the soon-to-be world champion, finding a way out of a very difficult spot. After Karjakin played e6, black's position was absolutely critical, and he recovered in under 15 moves. And will Karjakin fully bail out with rook takes a6? If he does that, the game should end in a draw. If he doesn't pick up the pawn on a6, I think he runs the risk of being worse. In fact, I think after rook takes a6, rook takes c2, Carlsen would not accept a draw here. He's got the two bishops. He's got the more active rook. His king on e8 is perfectly safe. And he's got all sorts of shenanigans like bishop f6 to d4 to attack f2. He's got a back rank check on c1 that could be unpleasant in conjunction with another check on e5. And Karjakin desperately trying to trade rooks. He plays the move rook a6 to c6, and a trade of rooks would go a long way toward helping white secure that draw. Now, one strange option for Magnus, he could take the rook and then play bishop a2 to d5 and actually try to trap that white knight on the queen side and later pick it up with a joint attack from the bishop and the king. And Carlsen, let's see what decision he makes. This is a big moment. He can also play rook b2 or rook e2. He plays rook b2, so he decides to keep the rooks on the board. But Karjakin has to be so careful. That knight on a5, it's on the side. It has no accessible squares as of now. Maybe c4 is the only square. Carlsen delivering a check on b1, forcing Karjakin's rook back. Rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, and bishop to d5, stalemating the knight on the side of the board. And Karjakin is in big trouble here. Carlsen is threatening bishop c3 to attack the knight with his dark squared bishop. Now, Karjakin can defend that knight with his own dark squared bishop, but what will happen if Carlsen ambles up with his king? And that is exactly what he's doing, because if the king and the dark squared bishop both attack white's knight, Karjakin will not be able to defend it as he desperately tries to bring his own king up to f1 for assistance, but he's not fast enough. King b6 by Carlsen. He's already made contact with the knight, and there goes the bishop back to d8. He's trapped the knight. What an incredible endgame effort by Carlsen. He has trapped the knight, and now all he has to do is conserve as many kingside pawns as possible. Look how patiently he plays g6. Why give up the g7 pawn? Karjakin desperately tries to bring his king up to the center. White's only hope for a draw here is to use the king to pick up as many of black's pawns as possible to trade all of the pawns off the board, because two bishops against one bishop is, in fact, a theoretical draw. But there is no way that Carlsen is going to allow any further pawns to get traded. Karjakin sees nothing better than to throw in the towel. A beautiful effort by Carlsen. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these videos. Thank you so much for watching.